A man hit the wood of Nora Hayes' door hard enough that her coffee mug rattled on its saucer. He stayed there, pressed with wet shoulders and a coat clinging like a second skin, breathing rough through a shirt soaked in city rain. Nora's protectiveness woke before her questions. She jammed the deadbolt, unhooked the chain, and pulled him inside, one arm under the man's armpit while the other fumbled for a towel. The immediate problem was exposure. The stranger had the look of someone who could not afford to be seen like this. By the third step into the kitchen, Nora noticed the watch. Heavy, custom, the kind a boardroom door would know by sound. By the fifth breath in the tiny room, she realized the stakes. Her apartment sat 3 floors above a narrow Brooklyn street, where a single flash could change a life. She moved first, because she understood what would come if she didn't act. "Come on, Nora," voice even, "sit at the table." She guided him to the single wooden chair. His hands trembled as he did not resist. He smelled of rain, of cedar and something sharp she could not place. She stripped his wet coat without asking and tossed it over the back of a spare chair. He let her. He did not look at her. He folded into himself at the table. Nora set the kettle on the stove and lit the flame with her thumb, pressing down the lighter. The kitchen smelled of old coffee and dish soap. The light over the sink hummed. She kept her movements practical. Pour, stir, set a mug in front of him. Actions now. Protection before interrogation, name. Nora, when the man still would not meet her eyes. Her voice carried the warmth of a woman used to giving addresses to neighbors and to wiring small favors for friends. He blinked. "Elias," he said. "Elias Mercer." The name landed like a stone. She froze with the kettle halfway to the cup. The apartment felt suddenly too small for all the things the name implied. Headlines, bodyguards, a motorcade spread fast through the wrong kind of rumor. Nora slid the mug forward and did not say his name again. The sound of his last name in the kitchen triggered a change in her that went beyond protectiveness. A second feeling arrived. Apprehension. She noticed it in the way her palms tightened on the counter. She kept pouring coffee, because motion kept panic at bay. "You need to warm up," she said. "Sit." "Don't move much." Her sentences were short. Her hands moved with an economy learned from cooking for a table that could not wait. He put both hands around the mug like it was an offered life preserver. He made a small sound, something between a laugh and a sob. "Why are you here?" "Nora." He swallowed. "I don't know where else to go." The answer was a simple line. It arrived wet and thin. Elias S. Steele, blue eyes, found the rim of his cup but did not hold Nora's face for longer than a beat. There was a tightness in his jaw. He rubbed his temples with a thumb and forefinger until the skin reddened. That action told Nora more than words did. The man kept count of pain with his hands. A newsprint edge slipped from beneath his coat when he had sat down. Nora's fingers brushed it against her palm. She unfolded the paper because hands need reasons. The photograph took her breath. A polished portrait of Elias Mercer in a suit, a headline about an unexpected bored resignation. The watch on his wrist was unmistakable. The kitchen had been a scene of charity a heartbeat earlier. Now it was a risk. Her protectiveness shifted into calculation. If the building saw a flash through the curtains, if someone recognized him on the stoop, this small mercy could become a public unmaking. She set the paper down, folded with care, and slid it under a plate. "You waited until dawn?" she asked. He pressed his thumb into the mug as if to hold himself together. "I couldn't sleep. I walked. I forgot where I was supposed to be." Nora kept her tone steady. "Do you have someone coming for you?" He laughed short. "People are always coming for me." "They were not coming now?" The laugh cut into a pause heavy with tiredness. His shoulders hunched. A memory, concrete and quick, flicked across his face. A child's birthday cake he had missed that year. He did not say the words. He closed his mouth. The stairwell door banged on the next landing, then muffled voices. Nora's head snapped toward the sound. The man at her table flinched. Footsteps stopped. A low voice carried up the stairwell. "Elias." Elias Mercer, you need to come with us now. It was not a friendly tone. Nora moved before she thought. She put herself between the door and the kitchen window, palms flat on the counter. The action felt like armor. She glanced at Elias. He had his hands on the mug, fingers white. He looked smaller than his height suggested. The door opened a sliver and a face peered in. A man in a black coat with a clipped haircut and a nameplate stitched inside his collar, Gideon Shaw. The man said, "Private security. We need you to come." Nora cut him off. "He can't go out like this. Give him 5 minutes. He looks sick." She kept her voice steady but firm. Gideon studied her the way a man takes inventory in a room where a celebrity has crossed a threshold he shouldn't have. Mr. Mercer has duties. He cannot remain here. There are photographers. There are. A camera shutter clicked from the street below. A single rapid pop. The sound sounded wrong in the kitchen, final and sharp. It lifted a current of panic through Elias that made him press his heels to the floor. From the window, Nora could see a silhouette across the street. A lone figure with a camera aimed at their building. The figure remained still, finger on the shutter. A small flash flared. Nora's breath caught. The kitchen was suddenly a glass box with someone looking in. Nora turned back to the stairwell. "Do you have ID for him?" she asked Gideon. Gideon's jaw nudged. "I have instructions. But he needs to step outside to confirm his arrival." It won't be long. His voice wanted compliance. Nora closed her hands on the counter until her knuckles whitened. She thought of the ways public scrutiny had eaten people she knew. A cousin whose landlord changed locks because a picture showed her at the wrong place. A neighbor who lost custody because a photo was misread. She would not hand Elias to that process. That decision was a physical thing inside her. The narrowing of breath, the pressing down on a choice. This was protectiveness turning angry. As Gideon hesitated, Nora reached into the chair where his coat draped and found a small photograph folded and worn at the edges. She opened it with fingers that did not shake. The photograph showed a child with a gap-toothed grin holding a paper boat. On the back someone had written a name in small, careful letters. "Finn." She looked at Elias. "Finn?" she asked. Elias' mouth moved. Sound came, not formed at once. "My boy," he said. "He lives with his mother. I missed things. I thought I could fix it later." The sentence fell apart around the weight of what he had missed. He set the mug down too hard. Coffee splashed across the table and onto the newspaper. Gideon shifted, eyes flicking to the photo, then back to Elias. "Mercer," he said softer, "we can arrange privacy. But we must go." A flash cut through the thin curtain again, closer. A camera shutter stuttered. The sound landed like a hand on the small of Nora's back. Her heart beat in her throat. She walked to the window and pulled the curtain further closed. The photographer across the street had stepped to a window and raised his camera higher. A name came to her quickly from the small town rumor cycles. Vivian Park, freelance, sells the early moments and the late ones for a living. Vivian's reflection in the glass looked like the lens, small, intent, patient. Nora's next decisions had to be fast and precise. She turned back to Gideon. "If he leaves, that man will get a photograph, and it will be on a wire within minutes. Nora, if it gets out that a child is involved, it won't be about his grief. It will be a story that will scrape him raw. There has to be another way." Gideon hesitated a beat longer. For the first time his posture showed the possibility of negotiation. He tapped a palm against his coat and found something in the inside pocket. A small card. He held it between thumb and forefinger. "We can speak with the photographer. Gideon, we can offer a small payment to hold images. It's not ideal, but it buys time." Nora's mind narrowed to one procedural motion. Make a deal that kept Elias inside for a little longer. "Do it now," she said. "Talk to him. Tell him to stand down. Tell him there's a press briefing in an hour." Gideon nodded and turned back to the stairwell. "Vivian," he called down into the hall, loud enough for the street to listen. The voice from below did not answer. There came instead a harsher rhythm. the shutter clicking fast, continuous. Nora felt the kitchen air change. Elia's shoulders rose and fell with a ragged breath. She moved beside him and placed a hand on his arm. The contact was small and practical. A check, a rhythm. He looked up at her then, and the fragile thread between them tightened. "You can stay for 5 minutes." Gideon from the stairwell, voice carrying. "Then we escort you." "We can keep you here all morning." Nora's jaw worked. 5 minutes was not enough. She listened to Gideon recite the rule, as if recitation could replace judgment. Outside, a camera hissed again. Vivien's silhouette moved, stepping away from the window as if testing angles. "Tell him to wait on the stoop or I'll call the police." Vivian suddenly through the staircase. Her voice was rough with distance and wind. "I done play games. If he's here, I take it." Nora felt the concrete click of time. Action was required now to tilt the scale. She slid a mug over, pulling Elias to safety behind the counter, where the sink blocked the line of sight to the window. Her hands worked on something else. She opened the top drawer and found the small jar of bread clips, the one she used to keep recipe cards from sliding. She tied one end of a tea towel to the handle of the curtain and looped the other to the leg of a chair. It was a crude rig. It made no aesthetic sense. It worked. Elias watched quietly while she tied the knot. His fingers trembled on the mug. "You don't have to do that," he said. Nora kept her voice flat. "I do." The staircase quieted. Gideon returned and held up a small hand to indicate a pause. He had spoken to Vivian and negotiated, brokered a temporary hold. Nora could tell by his face that money had been mentioned. Vivian, across the street, had come down a notch. The shutters clicked less frequently. The kitchen had not yet been savaged by light. Inside, the room smelled of coffee and damp cloth. Elias' eyes went to the photograph of Finn. He touched the folded corner like a man checking the seam of a wound. "Why did you come here?" Nora again, softer. Elias let out a breath that might have been a laugh. "I walked away from a board meeting and couldn't remember the name of the highway. I got out of the car at a red light and kept walking until my shoes filled with water. I thought if I kept moving, I'd find a place where I could be small. I didn't expect a kitchen, nor a nothing for a long beat." She measured her next step. Protection had shifted into curiosity, then into a basic human task. Keep a man breathing long enough to decide whether to trust him. A second external event arrived as if time had decided to test them. A neighbor's door opened below with a child's shout. A small dog barked. The concrete life of the building reminded them that their moment existed inside a world that didn't pause for celebrity. The noise gave Nora cover and a rhythm to work with. She filled another mug and set out a plate with a single piece of slightly stale banana bread. Elias looked at it and smiled a fraction. He took a bite like a man arriving on shore. "Nora," he said, using her name as if trying it on. "Thank you." His voice held a crack where a held in sob might have been. The name said less than the tone. Nora nodded once. Outside, the photographer's engine turned over and a car light swept past the kitchen window. A camera shutter fired. Someone on the street swore softly and laughed. Vivian's steps retreated. Gideon pushed his hand into his coat, fingers flexing on something. For a moment the pressure eased, then Elias broke. He did not speak grandly. He folded forward and put his head in his hands. His shoulders trembled. That trembling was not performative. It was a real body reaction to loss. Nora's hands moved without consent. She rubbed his back through his shirt. Her touch was practical, not theatrical, circular motions that meant, "Don't panic, breathe. Stay here." He one sentence then that held a concrete memory. "The last birthday I saw him, Finn cried because I missed the cake." The line landed in the kitchen with the weight of a fallen plate. He had named the specific event. That naming changed the room. It made the pain reachable. Gideon crouched near the doorway, voice lowered. "Miss Mercer, the press won't wait forever. We can arrange a car. We can." Elias lifted his head. His eyes were damp but clearer. "No," he said, "not yet. Not until I talk to someone who knows the truth." Not until I see Finn's drawing again, Nora studied him. She had seen men who thought a public apology could be purchased like a ticket. Elias' refusal to get up read differently. His choices in the small hours felt like a man trying to stitch together what he missed. That attempt made her decide to stay on his side for now. A new sound arrived at the window. A camera flashed too close. The curtains fluttered where the borrowed tie hadn't held perfectly. A white bloom of light sliced the room for a half-second. Vivian's lens had found a crack. Nora moved to the window and, without a word, pushed the curtain fully shut. The fabric scraped against the frame and settled. The city light damped out. The small mechanics of the kitchen returned. The kettle's faint whistle, the tap drip, the mug's rim tapped by a spoon. Vivian's voice came thin through the stairwell. Now closer, you can hide forever, she called. You'll get your picture one way or another. Her tone had an edge of hunger. Gideon answered with a practical counteroffer. Give us 10 minutes. We'll pay you. We'll keep the images private until we manage the release. The negotiation sounded like counting bills. It had an ugly arithmetic that Nora did not want to be part of. Yet Vivian's footsteps receded. Gideon turned to Nora and offered a smile that asked for gratitude he did not expect. Elias drank his coffee in long, small sips. He spoke then with short sentences, each one a careful choice. I have to call someone. My assistants are not here. I left a meeting. I don't know where. He stopped and pressed his forehead to his knuckles. Nora, I need to call my son's mother. I need to hear if he's okay. Nora leaned across the table and pushed the battered kitchen phone toward him. Do it here, she said. Do it now. He dialed with deliberate fingers. The line clicked. A woman's voice answered. Elias' words were clipped, direct and clumsy as a man learning to apologize aloud. This is Elias. Where is Finn? Can I speak to him? The voice on the other end hesitated. Nora watched the way Elias listened. His brow worked. His jaw moved like a metronome that measured guilt and hope. After a short exchange, his face changed. Relief and then caution. He's at school. The voice said he's okay. He made a paper boat. Why are you there, Elias? The words were simple. They contained an accusation and a practical demand. Elias stammered a reply. I walked. I don't want to scare him. I wanted to know he's all right. Nora kept her hands on the table. The small ring of her thumb warmed the wood. The phone call ended with arrangements. Elias would come by later to pick up Finn. The line closed with a promise to speak at 3. The promise sounded like a plan. It was brittle and immediate. Outside, the photographer's engine revved and then retreated. A car door slammed. Gideon exhaled. They'll hold for a bit, he said. You bought yourself time. Mercer, he called Elias by name with a professional distance that said nothing of sympathy. The kitchen slid into a thinner calm. Nora felt the weight of decisions. She had sheltered a public man, negotiated with security, contended with a photographer, and held the space where a private confession happened. Her actions had shifted the arc of the morning. Elias set the photograph of Finn on the table and smoothed the bent corner with his thumb. Thank you, he said again. The words were smaller now, less a plea than an acknowledgement of a bridge-built-in necessity. Nora made a small, contained gesture. She moved the cup of coffee closer and took the plate of banana bread. Eat something before you stand up, she said. You will need the energy, he obeyed. He ate with the careful movements of someone not used to small kindnesses. Each bite steadied him. Gideon stood by the doorway then, not leaving but not intruding. Vivian's distant engine faded down the block. Nora's protectiveness shifted a final time before the departure. It became a small negotiated trust. She handed Elias the soaked coat, now folded and warmed on a chair. You go when you're ready, she said. And keep your hand on the phone. Elias rose slowly. He tucked Finn's photograph into his breast pocket close to his heart. He paused at the threshold. Nora, he said, looking at her with a steadier gaze than before. If anyone asks, you found me on your stoop. You gave me coffee. He sounded like a man working to keep facts simple. She gave him a single nod. Gideon stepped forward and offered Elias his arm, with the businesslike courtesy of someone escorting an office chair through a crowd. The two men moved toward the stairwell. For a beat, Elias stopped and turned. I'll come back for the bread. It was a small promise. It was also an arrangement. Outside, Vivian's camera caught one last frame at the window, but Gideon raised a hand and a figure on the sidewalk nodded. Money exchanged. Pause purchased privacy. The stairwell door clicked closed behind them. A second flash popped on the street as the camera captured a retreating figure. Nora locked the door again, slid the chain across, and stood with her palms against the cool wood. The room smelled of coffee and wet coats. She felt the tremor of adrenaline ease, replaced by a hollow tiredness that tasted like copper under her tongue. She moved to the sink and rinsed out the cup Elias had used, the action precise and quiet. The newspaper beneath the cup was damp, but its headline remained legible. She folded it and slid it to the side. The kitchen light hummed. The countdown of the morning resumed. Tenants fetching laundry, the distant rumble of a bus, a dog barking twice in the courtyard. The final moment of the chapter arrived as a single external beat. A soft knock at the door, not from Gideon, not from Elias, but from the building manager. He stood on the threshold with a small frown and a clipboard, Ms. Hayes. The tenant below said there was a disturbance. "Everything all right?" he asked. Nora smiled a small, practical smile that did not reach the eyes. "Everything's fine," she said. "Just an unexpected guest." He studied her for a second, then shuffled his papers and retreated down the hall. Nora slid the deadbolt home and left the chain unhooked. She moved to the window, pulled the curtain a fraction to check the street. The light across had cooled. A single image might exist now in someone's camera, or it might be held behind an arrangement of cash and courtesy. Either way, the kitchen had been a refuge for a brief, important hour. Nora set a fresh mug on the table and sat down. She placed Finn's photograph on top of the folded newspaper, straightened its corner with a finger, and let herself breathe. The moment had been resolved enough for now. The next steps would come with the day, complicated and blunt. For the time being, the kitchen held what it had protected. She kept her eyes on the photograph until the knock sounded again, this time a softer, private sound that marked arrival rather than warning. Outside, someone coughed. The building resumed its small, ordinary noises. The chapter closed on the kitchen's light, steady and human, as the stairwell door clicked once more and the morning moved forward. A phone flare cut across the stairwell as Marco yelled, "Who is that?" Nora's suspicion flared first, quick and sharp, and she stepped back inside before the man could answer. The wet coat made a dark silhouette in her doorway. Rain dripped from the hem onto her doormat. He didn't look like a criminal. He looked like someone who had run until his legs failed. The stairwell brightened again as a camera phone found his face, and that small, bright rectangle turned a private crisis into an immediate public problem. Nora closed the door the way she always closed it, slow, with the lock sliding home like a practiced ritual. She kept one hand on the knob and one on the deadbolt, ready to push, ready to protect the small, battered space she'd kept in the building for years. The central problem arrived with the camera, exposure. If Elias Mercer was recognized here, her refuge would become a scene. That concrete threat shaped what she did next. Her fingers tightened on the deadbolt and her voice shortened into commands. "Marco, stop." "Marco, put that away," she said, louder than she planned. Marco kept talking in the stairwell. "Elias Mercer, are you kidding me? Open up!" Nora answered the stairwell with motion, not words. She forced the door closed and shoved the deadbolt down hard enough that the chain rattled. The man in her threshold blinked, water streaming from his hair, and his eyes searched hers for permission to stay. He made no attempt to explain. He only let himself be pulled across her threshold and into the cramped kitchen, coat leaving a wet ring on the floorboards. Nora moved automatically to the sink, set a kettle on to boil, and took the towel she kept hung on a peg. Suspicion shifted into something else under her skin, a protective, guarded irritation that made her shoulders square. She wiped his collar with measured, efficient motions as if wiping away a stain that could reach her neighbors. "Who are you?" she asked finally, using the name she had seen in headlines without speaking it. The man closed his hands around the towel and shook his head. "Elias," he said, standing there with the sound like it belonged to a stranger. The kitchen smelled of old coffee and day-old bread. The kettle began to whisper. Nora did not ask about money or titles. Whether he could breathe, whether he could stand, whether he needed to sit. Each question was a test and a tether. He slid into a chair as if his legs had given up on him. He pressed his palms to his temples and rubbed slow circles, jaw tight. The rain on his coat kept tapping the wooden floor with small, impersonal rhythms. She poured a cup of coffee without offering it. Her hands were steady, and her tone carried an instruction. "Answer her first." A shout from the stairwell tried to collapse the small room. "Open up." Marco called security. "People want to know who's in there." The building's runner of gossip and photos. He kept talking into his phone. Nora heard other noises too. Someone's heavy steps, a voice she knew. Alvarez clipped greeting as he arrived at the door. The external pressure arrived in waves, and with each wave Nora's muscles tightened. The suspicion that had opened the scene pivoted into anger toward the stairwell, toward the idea that private pain could be paraded. "Missa." Alvarez knocked sharp enough to rattle the male slot. "Nora, you know the rules," he said. "You can harbor strangers. Security will be called." His voice tried to be reasonable, but there was heat under it, a manager protecting building procedure and his own liability. The door stayed closed between them, and the hallway sounded like a separate, impatient world. Nora kept the deadbolt pressed down with both hands and matched form to form. "Mr. Alvarez," she said, and the name landed like a small barrier. He sweat. He was in the stairwell and someone took his picture. "I'm keeping him inside for now," she kept her words plain. When people began to shout their own versions of the truth into doorways, plainness worked better than speeches. Elias watched her with his chin low, eyes absently tracing the line where the window met the street. A notification ping landed on a pocketed phone on the counter. Elias' thumb found it as his hands trembled. He stared at the screen and then flinched. "They retrending already," he said, voice low. Nora read the headline when he shoved the device toward her. His name and a tragedy, dates, an official statement link, comments piling on. The second problem solidified. Anonymity had already been breached. That made sheltering him riskier by the minute. Nora had lived with small risks before: late rent, a leaky roof, the time a pipe froze and split under the sink. None of those risks had come with camera flashes and legal notices. The stakes here included her neighbors, her lease, and the threadbare stability she'd built after losses that had taught her to protect what could be protected. She wrapped a towel around Elias's shoulders because he would not let her do nothing, and because action steadied her. The touch was practical, not sentimental. "Hold until he stops shaking." Marco's voice rose. "Elias Mercer, are you okay? People want the truth." A pair of footsteps paused on the landing so close she heard the rubber of a sneaker against the metal step. The manager's voice returned, sharper. "Nora, I have to insist. You can't keep him here. There are procedures." Nora cut him off without raising her voice. "Mr. Alvarez, I will not throw him back into the stairwell." Not with cameras. She could hear the word, eviction, at the edge of his reply and knew it was both a threat and a lever. He used it because it had weight. She used a container of force in response. The presence of a neighbor, Mrs. Patel, at the door a moment later with a thermos in her hands and a calm that's been practiced through decades of building squabbles. "Nora, he looks like he needs to sit, Mrs. Patel." She set the thermos on Nora's counter, then tapped the door with a single, deliberate knock. "My name is Patel. I'm vouching for her. You are not evicting her today, Alvarez, Mrs. Patel's voice had the authority of someone who paid attention to the small rules that kept an old building together. Her arrival formed an intervening fact. Another resident who could name Nora and offer practical help. That intervention shifted the balance. The manager paused and made a calculation in a tone that used numbers and liability language. Marco muttered into his phone and tried to angle his camera toward the people. The door stayed shut. The paparazzo's presence remained an external threat, an object that repeatedly altered what safety meant, but the immediate eviction threat receded. Elias kept his hands clasped at his knees and watched Mrs. Patel pour 2 cups from the thermos. His fingers were slow, deliberate, as if measuring how much he could accept. He took a sip and closed his eyes as if tasting something ordinary for the first time in hours. The private act of drinking became a small, humanizing counterpoint to the public machine humming outside. Nora watched him drink and felt a different feeling settle under the earlier suspicion. Protectiveness that moved through her muscles into her speech. "Elias," she said, and used his name to ground herself. "You need to tell me what happened in the last hour." She did not ask for his biography. She for the immediate truth. He met her eyes, and the pause that followed said more than a paragraph of explanation. He spoke with a voice thickened by exhaustion. "They called me at 3. I ran," he said. "I didn't mean to." He stopped, swallowed, and looked at the counter where her kettle hissed. "I didn't mean to let it get out of control." Nora heard the specificity there. A phone call, running, something that had become public after his flight. That detail shifted their understanding. It suggested he had not come seeking spectacle, he had come seeking distance. She leaned forward and set a paper cup on the table. "Who called?" she asked. He named a person only by relation, a brief title dropped like a coin. He refused no names but did not spill the ones that would make this a tabloid feast. He kept the most private facts folded in, but he offered a small, consequential detail. He had left a hospital room, and someone outside had recognized his car. That detail, concrete and specific, created a harder direction for Nora's next choices. She could shelter him for a time, but she could not lie to the people downstairs if security threatened a legal response. Outside the door the pounding increased, and a new voice spoke through the letter slot. "Security's on the way. Open up, or we'll break it down." The line hardened. Nora could feel the apartment's threshold as the place where private and public collided, the scene where choices mattered in a legal and human way. Her hands found the knob and then found the deadbolt again. "Nora, you can keep him here." A little as though his voice had softened when Mrs. Patel spoke up for her. "You know the building rules." Liability, he tried rapid sentences, the kind that sound like rules but function as threats. Nora answered with a different kind of rapid sentence. "Miss Alvarez, he's not dangerous. Let me call a lawyer if you want." "Mrs. Patel backs me. We'll keep the door closed until security shows id." She let one fast exchange land like steel. The manager pressed. She pressed back. In that argument, the chapter's tension moved from purely emotional to procedural. Who could claim authority over the space, and what counts as reasonable action when someone needs shelter? The sound of shoes altered again. A man in a security jacket loomed at the peephole, his face a mask of procedure. He spoke through the door in a voice used to settling disputes. "This is company security. Open up for an ID check." Nora weighed options. She could open and hope a badge signaled a human with discretion, or she could refuse and risk a forced entry. The suspicion that had begun the chapter had evolved, first into protectiveness, then into a cautious calculation about public exposure versus private safety. Elias' voice cut across that calculation. "Don T. let them in," he said. His baritone had a tremor now, and he rubbed his temples with slow, small movements as if to flatten the trimmer with touch. "Please. Please, Nora." Her name and the pleer removed the manager's policies from her shoulders and placed a human temperature on the choice. It was the kind of emotional shift that rearranged decisions. She now had direct responsibility to a person in front of her. Nora moved toward the door and opened the peephole just enough to look out. She scanned the security man and the cluster of phones at the landing where Marco still crouched with his camera. The sight of them together, uniformed security and a paparazzo, made the risk concrete. She closed the peephole and locked the chain. "We will not let them in without Ed," she said through the closed door. "And whoever breaks this lock will answer to me." She used a short sentence, not a speech. It was a physical, binding promise. The hallway voices composed themselves into negotiation. Marco tried an offer, a gentler pitch, the kind that suggests a mutual shortcut. A single picture and then they all go. "Marco, we're not doing that, mder." Alvarez more tired than angry. The building had rules. The paparazzo had his appetite. "Mrs. Patel hummed a low sound into the doorway, the kind of sound that says, "I saw you. I remember you. Don't cheapen this moment for a photograph." A loud knock announced a new presence. It was firm and repeated. The manager called. "Security will wait at the lobby." "You need to comply or I'll have to call the police." His sentence had the weight of escalation. Nora felt the apartment shrink around that weight. She looked at Elias. He stared at his hands. They trembled with the small, raw movements of someone holding back grief. The kettle shrieked when steam forced pressure. She turned it off and used that motion to shift the energy in the room. "Elias, Mrs. Patel is going to make a statement that you need shelter for now. Nora, we will not open to anyone without Ed. If the police are called, we'll tell them the truth. We will not hand you over to cameras." Her voice was low and direct. He nodded once, a small agreement that became a new emotional shift in both of them. From defensive secrecy to a fragile alliance. The crowd outside thinned only slightly. Marco posted a live clip to his followers and narrated what he could see. "There's someone in there. She won't let us in." His words felt like a needle. A camera's mechanical click had become the instrument that could force either eviction or headline. That reality produced the miniature cliffhanger the chapter needed, a sudden escalation that rearranged choices. Security's footsteps receded for a moment as Alvarez made a phone call. Then the door shook from new impetus. Someone jostled it as if to force a reply. Nora stepped directly into the doorframe and planted her feet. "No one comes in without Ed," she said again, and this time there was a steel under the warmth. Her actions tightened into a defensive set of movements. Hand on bolt, shoulder blocking the opening, body set to protect. Elias suddenly bowed his head and his shoulders collapsed. He slid from the chair to the floor as if the floor were a magnet. He started to breathe in staccato pulls, each one shallow and quick. "Mrs. Patel moved without ceremony and crouched beside him, pressing her palm to his back in steady, simple pressure. "Breathe with me, love," she said. The line carrying the authority of someone who had soothed many panic attacks in laundry rooms and small kitchens. Her voice created a new emotional shift. Panic softened into a slow attempt at control. The manager called again, louder and with more official language. "Nora, if you obstruct security, you will face consequences." He counted on fear to win. Nora answered with action. She moved to stand between Elias and the door, hands flat on the wood, as if she could physically hold back the swarm outside. Her posture said she would not move. Marco's camera clicked, and a new wave of posts began. Then, a single unexpected thing changed the momentum. A woman in the hallway, one of the building's long-term residents, stepped forward and put her hand on Mir. "Alvarez, Sam, let her close the door." "Alvarez," she said, "this isn't a normal morning. He looks like he needs help." The neighbor's name was Mrs. Gomez, and she repeated details Nora had not expected. She had seen Elias leave the hospital. She had walked past his car. That single specific observation reframed the crowd's appetite into curiosity that could be answered with details, not a forced entry. Marco cursed under his breath and decided to angle for the male slot. A hand tried to slide a camera lens through, and Nora reacted with a fast movement. She stuck out her forearm and blocked the slot with a paper cup. It was a small, ridiculous action, but it read on camera as defiance. The manager barked a new line about liability and the police. Mrs. Patel and Mrs. Gomez replied with names, details, and calm authority that made the manager hesitate. Eventually the knocks slowed. The security man at the lobby radioed back that they had orders to wait and to verify before any forced entry. Marco kept recording, but the immediate physical threat of a door kicked in had reduced to a chorus of comments and a press feed. Elias remained on the floor, palms flat to his knees, breathing more deliberately now. Nora sat in the chair opposite him and watched the way his hands clenched and unclenched. She small, concrete questions. What had he seen in the hospital room? Who had called him? When had someone recognized his car? He answered in fragments and names. Each fragment was a small reveal that changed the shape of the morning, one detail at a time. He revealed that a relative's statement had made his loss public that morning, and that stinging fact explained why the stairwell had filled with cameras so quickly. They argued twice more with the manager across the door in short lines, 3 to 6 exchanges each time, until the manager finally boarded a train of cautious words and left for his own records. Marco left too, not because he had been dissuaded, but because another story had pulled him away. Mrs. Patel lingered to pack a sandwich and to offer practical instructions about where Elias could sit and how to warm his hands. Her small, steady care anchored the kitchen. When the crowd was gone and the kettle had cooled, Nora locked the door and sank back down to the chair opposite Elias. He tapped his phone once, deleted a notification, and then turned the device face down on the table. He had been stripped of pretense. Her kitchen had been transformed into a small, honest space where grief could be fumblingly present. The emotional pressure eased but did not disappear. There was a new, quiet attention that asked what came next. Elias looked up with a face that suddenly showed its age in the small freckle of a crow's foot beside his eye. "Nora," he said. And the name was soft and searching. "I done to have anywhere else to go right now." Not without cameras and statements. His admission was not dramatic, but it was precise and consequential. It demanded a choice from her that had legal and moral weight. She answered with a practical motion. "You can stay until noon. You'll sit in the back, away from the window. Mrs. Patel will bring a thermos and some bread. I'll put the kettle on." Her choices were concrete. The decision to shelter him for a set time contained a promise and a limit. It was not poetic. It was a plan. Elias nodded and slid his hand into his jacket pocket, pulling out a small object wrapped in a paper towel. He set it on the table between them. It was a photograph, crumpled at the edges, of a hospital room with a person in a bed and a window that let in grey light. He did not explain who had been in the bed. The image did the explaining with quiet force. Nora reached out and smoothed the paper with a fingertip. At that precise moment the door knocked again, harder and faster. Nora's hand flew to the deadbolt, and the chapter closed on that concrete action. She moved to the door and set her palm against the wood, ready to decide whether the next voice at the threshold would be an ally or a threat. Emotion root, suspicion. Emotion, shift, suspicion, protectiveness, fear, relief. Protectiveness, alliance, exhaustion, guarded hope. A camera flash cracked across the kitchen window and landed on the back of a wet coat. Nora's protectiveness flared before she could form a question. She stepped between the glass and the man hunched on her linoleum, one palm pressed flat to the sill. "Hey, get back," Marco shouted from the stairwell. Voice raw with the kind of attention that always wanted witnesses. The flash came again, relentless and bright, then a shape crouched on the curb, lens aimed up, like a hunter waiting for an easy shot. Nora moved first. She caught the sleeve that dripped onto the doormat and pulled the stranger inward, closing the gap the photographer tried to widen. She did not touch his face. She did not ask why he had clambered to her window in the rain. Her hands smelled of dish soap and coffee grounds. She used the smell to anchor herself against the scrape of exposure. Protectiveness pushed her through the doorway, an impulse keyed by the night he'd knocked hard enough to scare her cat, and the memory of Marco hollering about trouble. She had learned to act before questions in this building. The stairwell always collected other people's noises, drunk arguments, careless steps, a baby's late wail. This morning it collected a different noise. A man who could not make himself small and a man on the curb with a camera, trying to make a story. Back, Nora to the photographer through the cracked door. Voice pulled flat and exact. Back away from the window, she could feel the words in her chest, measured and deliberate. She would not let the building turn someone's rawness into a headline. The stranger at her counter kept his hood low. Rain beaded along the collar of a coat that had seen better nights. Nora's first sight of him had been a soaked silhouette and the whiplash of instinct. Close him in, feed him, get him warm. Now the room had folded to a different pressure. Curiosity and danger pressing from opposite directions. Someone out on the street had already begun to narrate him. A flashbulb caption would claim a reason before he could name one. Nora reached for the kettle. Her movements were practical, not theatrical. She put water on, checked the burner, found the coffee tin, and the chipped mug she used on mornings that needed proof. She set a second mug beside the first and moved the mugs like small shields. Nora, Marco called, impatient. Who is he? A friend, she said, and the word landed awkward and half true on the air. She did not mean friend in the way Marco would understand it. She meant someone who arrived at her door soaked and breaking. Saying friend aloud softened the edge of the stairwell sanger. Saying it also bought her a fraction of time to choose how public this moment would be. The kettle began to sigh. Nora could hear the city breathing beyond the window, distant traffic, the soft hiss of tires on wet asphalt, and the photographer's feet stepping closer for another angle. She lifted the lid of the coffee tin with steady fingers, and the sound of metal on metal felt, for a moment, like a quiet reprieve. The man at the counter raised his hands as if to keep himself intact. He smelled of cedar and cold, a clean scent Nora tried to pin down with memory. She glanced at him for the first close look. He was taller than her doorway had promised. Broad at the shoulders, coat weighed down with rain. His hair was plastered to his head, and when he tipped his face toward the table, she saw the lines at his eyes and a small scar at his temple. Nora's chest tightened with something that was almost suspicion and almost pity. She did not ask his name. She set two mugs in front of him and slid one across the counter as if that action could anchor the morning. Marco's voice climbed another octave. Who are you? He demanded from the hallway. His shadow moved across the peaful like a warning. Nora met the shadow with a practical decision. She stepped into the doorway and hooked the deadbolt open with one hand and closed it with the other, a gesture that made Marco's next words stop at his teeth. Marco, Nora, this isn't the time. Go downstairs. Now, her voice was not soft, it was precise. Marco hesitated, then stomped away with the kind of clumsy retreat that announces to anyone listening, a truce that will not be kept. The photographer did not go. He angled his lens through the smeared window and clicked again, a metallic rat, tat that scraped against Nora's skin. She crossed to the window, planting her palms on the sill and looking straight at the man out there. He looked back, but did not lower the camera. The image he chased would sell on anyone's front page. A well-known man down in an ordinary kitchen. Nora felt a second root of conflict sprout inside her. This building tolerated gossip, and it tolerated compromise. It did not tolerate cruelty. The man at her counter kept his gaze low. He folded his hands around his coffee mug like it might hold him together. Nora watched him breathe, long in, long out, counting the seconds. His hand trembled when he set the envelope on the table. It slid, sodden at the fold. When he peeled back the flap to show the seal, Nora recognized the way someone tries to make an exchange of urgency look ordinary. Please, he said. and the word came out threaded with a trimmer that was more need than demand. Nora's suspicion softened. She could not read private grief like a font. She read it like a bruise showing through thin skin. "Please keep this quiet," he added, and though she had not asked. She understood that he feared attention, not for what it would bring to him, but for what it would reopen. The envelope had a return address stamped at the corner. A tabloid name loomed on the street outside like a growl. Nora's eyes flicked toward the window. The photographer made a small triumphant sound, as if a body had been set for a close-up. The kettle clicked off. Nora poured without looking, filling both mugs, and then a third for herself. She slid one toward the man, and set a coaster under it with hands that refused to shake. An external sound pushed through the bathroom fan and into the kitchen. Footsteps, not Marco's. They were heavier and measured, polite in the way someone used to being obeyed can be. Mrs. Alvarez's shoes scuffed against the hallway tile. She stood in the doorway as she often did, arms crossed, mouth a thin line that had kept the building in order for decades. She had a way of looking over people that asked what right they had to take up space. "There's a crowd out there," she said, and then, because she always did, she asked the question the building wanted asked. "Who is he?" Nora felt the room narrow. The photographer clicked again, louder. Mrs. Alvarez's face tightened. She straightened in the doorway as if ready to summon management. Nora set her mug down and stepped forward to meet the superintendent's eyes. "He's with me." "Nora, he's not harming anyone." "Give him a minute." The words were both an explanation and a gentle command. Mrs. Alvarez's jaw worked. She sniffed and then, "Because there are rules that even she will not break," she said. "You have until 9. "Then I'm calling the office." It was a boundary, not a threat. The man at the counter folded his hands atop the envelope like a shield. He did not move when Nora lifted the blinds a fraction to check the street. He did not look up when the flash from the photographer turned the glass into a mirror for the building's indifference. Nora could see the face in the newspaper folded on the photographer's bag. A familiar set of cheekbones, a hairline, a face the tabloids had named and then used. Nora's mind supplied the missing detail before he spoke it. The man at her table was the face on the front page. He noticed her glance and made a small, resigned sound. "They know me," he said. "They always know me." His voice was low, and Nora felt something in it break across the syllables, distance between the life the headlines assigned him and the person who huddled in her kitchen. She did not reach for his name yet. She waited for him to offer it. He did not. Instead, he pushed the envelope toward her, and the edge of his thumb left a wet ring on the paper. The photographer rapped on the glass with the end of his lens, a childish, impatient knock. "Come on," he called. "We want an image." "Come out, mister." "Say something." The photographer's voice had the cheap thrill of a man who knows that the world will pay for clarity and will not pay for compassion. Nora felt anger boil clean and practical. She crossed to the door and placed the kettle between herself and the hallway. "No," she said. "Not here." Not now. Her hand rested on the doorknob like a shield. Marco's anger came back in staccato steps. "Nora, you can he began, but Nora cut him off. "Marco," she said, and that single use of his name did not ask permission. "This is not something for the hallway. Go downstairs and tidy the mailroom. Get Mrs. Alvarez coffee." "Be gone." Marco muttered a string of complaints, but there was something in his mutter that showed he believed her today, and that belief gave Nora the narrow margin she needed to breathe. She turned back to the man at her table. He had peeled the edge of the envelope back far enough to show a single photograph folded inside. A child's face in a muddy park, hair caught in a wind. The photograph was older, the print softened at the crease. The man's fingers closed around it like he might be able to keep the image intact. Nora's eyes read the picture and then dropped to the name printed at the bottom of the paper, Elias Mercer. The room settled long enough for the city to grow louder around them. Nora recognized the name. She had seen it in magazine racks, on billboards, on the mutters of conversations in cabs. It came with a package. Wealth access, a private life that leaked only when someone else decided to sell it. The man at her counter had not been a silhouette anymore. He was the same face the papers chased. Nora felt an emotion flip inside her, suspicion settling into compassion, and then, quick as a silver coin dropping, a new hesitation. Why had he come here of all places? What would he gain by breaking himself open in a stranger's kitchen? Elias did not answer the question. He set the photograph down and smoothed his palm over it with care. "People think they'll understand when they see the picture," he said. And his voice tilted toward a tired resignation. "They think they'll know what to feel." Nora stayed at the counter and did not move to put a hand on his shoulder. In this room she had learned to let people make the first reach. She set a pastry on a napkin and slid it near him instead, crust warm and flaky, a small, steady thing. "Mrs. Alvarez crossed her arms and looked at the envelope. "You carry money in that," she said, sharp as a coin. "You can pay for your silence here. But you can make us your stage." The superintendent's presence pressed the situation into its public seam. Nora saw the calculation cross Elias's face. He unfolded the wet newspaper and his own portrait spread across the front page, eyes a public commodity. He looked smaller with every visible headline. Suddenly, the photographer's camera clicked faster. He had found a new angle that turned the window into a frame and Elias's shoulder into a headline. Nora moved again. She stepped into the doorway, put her palm flat against the glass, and looked the man on the curb in the eye. "You want a picture? Take one without him in it." Her words were not a plea. They were a boundary made visible. The photographer blinked as if affronted. "Lady, you can tell me who to photograph," he said. His voice carried the indignation of entitlement. He took another photo anyway, hands quick. The flash made the room glow for a second and left a ghost of light on the tiles. Outside, a small troop had gathered, neighbors leaning at elbows, whispers multiplying into a chorus. The pressure built in the hallway like steam. Nora felt it push at the door and at her confidence. She could have handed Elias the envelope back and shut the door, could have let the building's rules and fear of being noticed steer her choices. She did not. Instead, she reached across the counter and set both hands on the envelope. "You stay," she said to the room more than to him. "Until the photographer leaves, or until you tell me he can go. I am not asking for money. I'm asking for quiet." The words were a bargain, not a surrender. She would not let the kitchen that held her life become a spectacle. Elias's fingers tightened on the mug. He looked up at her with a glance that scraped away the headlines and left something raw and human. "Nora," he said suddenly, and the name surprised them both. It carried a recognition that was not just courtesy. It was the way a stranger can use a neighbor's name like a rope. He pushed the envelope back toward her, and for the first time in the morning there was a clear request in his mouth instead of a folded plea. "Please keep me here. I need a few hours where no one knows where I am. Can you do that?" Nora felt an emotion shift then, suspicion to pity to a quiet decision. She remembered the first night he smashed at her door. The way the mug had rattled on its saucer and the way he had seemed like a person trying to hold himself together by leaning on anything he could find. She thought of the pastry, the kettle, the chipped mug she kept for mornings when the world demanded proof. She thought of the times she had been helped by strangers and the times she had had to set firm lines. This was the choice she had to make now. "You can stay," she said, "for a few hours." She slid the sealed envelope into her drawer and closed it with a soft click. But no photos. No names out on the stoop. "Mrs. Alvarez Marco, this is over." Her voice folded each requirement into the room like a staple. "Mrs. Alvarez grunted but did not leave immediately. She squinted at Elias and then at Nora and finally shrugged the weight of the building's curiosity off her shoulders like a coat. She collected herself and said, "I'll watch the hall. You have until 9, Nora. I mean it, she left a warning, not a threat, and the hallway quieted as she closed the door. The photographer lingered a heartbeat, then stood up, smoothed his jacket, and walked away, but not before he flicked his wrist to capture another furtive shot. The flash was smaller now, a private mischief. Once outside, he folded back into the city. No one else made a fuss. The stairwell gave up its notice, and the building resumed the small, practical function of ordinary life. Marco returned with a bag of steaming coffee and a face that wore a grudging respect for being told off. "You did good, Nora," he muttered. Setting the bag down with a thump, he walked around the table and passed Elias the cup with a forced casualness that only partially masked his curiosity. "Who are you?" he asked directly, which was the kind of question Nora had been avoiding. Elias looked at Marco and then at Nora. He set the mug down and rubbed his temples in a habit Nora had seen before. He seemed acutely aware of the shape of his own hands. "Elias Mercer," he said, short and level. The name landed in the room like a claim. Marco blinked and then whistled under his breath. An involuntary recognition turned into a sound that stripped embarrassment from hunger. "Shit, Marco, you really Elias Mercer?" He looked sheepish at the confession, and then braver at his knowledge. "Everything okay?" he added, like someone trying to be useful and failing but still trying. Elias stared at the table for a long count. He picked up the photograph again, smoothing the edge where the rain had kinked the paper. "No," he said finally. "No, it's not okay. My sister died last week." The sentence was a concrete fact, not a metaphor. The words landed factual and sharp, removing speculation. Nora felt the room empty of any remaining pretense. She had expected many things: fame, scandal, a plea for money. She had not named this particular loss in her head. It arrived like a cold, accurate wind. Elias' hands trembled when he said the word sister, and he pressed his thumbs into his eyes in a way that looked like trying to force the world to be less bright. Nora watched his throat move and saw swallowing, not composure. Mrs. Alvarez had returned to the doorway, her face softened in a way Nora rarely saw. Marco's posture went from prying to careful, as if he suddenly understood the limits of his curiosity. Nora stepped to the sink and took a dish towel. She dabbed at a spill on the counter with precise, unhurried motions, as if small acts could anchor larger weather. "Do you want to sit?" she asked. "Do you want me to call anyone?" The questions were clean and useful rather than sentimental. Elias ignored the invitation to make a list. Griefer's ways of refusing inventories. "No calls," he said, "no statements, no pictures. I need an hour where no one can place me." He used the precise language of someone arranging a retreat. Nora bought a breath and then nodded. She measured out actions instead of empathy. She poured more coffee and then set a plate with 2 slices of bread she warmed under the broiler. "Eat," she said. "You will sit. We'll close the blinds." "Marco, put a chair by the door and pretend to be a plant." Marco snorted and played along, shifting a potted fern into the room's line of sight as a comic shield. The small absurdity eased the tension. They closed the blinds. The kitchen dimmed to amber. Outside, the city continued its indifferent shift. Footsteps passed, a delivery truck idled, someone shouted a greeting down the block. Inside, the room condensed to the ritual they had created: coffee, a warm slice of bread, the envelope tucked away. Elias lifted the mug with both hands and drank like the motion might fill something that ached. They spoke in short sentences then, the room obeying a new rule. The conversation would be functional and kind. Nora practical questions about his sister, her name, whether she had a partner, whether there would be a service. Elias answered in clipped fragments that revealed only what he wanted revealed. "Penelope," he said after a pause. "No children. Small service at St. Bede." He paused between each fact, measuring how much he would give away. Nora kept her replies to the point. Wrote to the church, the name of a florist she trusted, where Mrs. Alvarez might borrow chairs. Marco offered to pick up paper cups if they needed them. Mrs. Alvarez suggested a charity to ring up for floral help. Each offering was a small rope thrown toward a man who had been holding himself together on rumor and paper. At one point, Elias lifted the sealed envelope from the drawer and set it on the table with a sharp sound. He met Nora's eyes and his hands were steady. "I can stay here forever," he said. "I will handle the fallout. I can pay you if that's what you want." He pushed money into the room as if it were the simplest currency to close the morning's commerce. Nora looked at the envelope and then at the photograph of Penelope. The pastry on the napkin had gone cold. She could take his money and call it done. She could refuse. There was a moral calculus that sat in her chest like a small ledger. Her protectiveness had led her to this kitchen. Now her sense of self demanded she set terms. "You don't get to buy privacy when you use people's pain for headlines," she said. "But you can pay for a cab and some food. You can write a check to St. Bedes for the service. You cannot buy my silence for a headline you make into a pity story." Her voice was measured, not showy. She meant the list she'd offered. Elias's jaw moved. He looked older for the choice. He exhaled and then, in a move that surprised Nora, he folded the envelope back closed and slid it into his coat. "I won't make a spectacle," he said. "I'll be handled. I know the meetings that will come. For now, thank you. For the pastry, for the kettle, for keeping it quiet. I mean it." The words were small and precise. Nora nodded. She had not wanted gratitude displayed like a trophy. An odd thing happened then. The photographer returned to the stoop and tapped the glass lightly, as if testing whether the city had permission to enter. He found no permission and left. Mrs. Alvarez washed a mug in the sink and hummed a hymn under her breath that was not a prayer, but a way to keep her hands moving. Marco, a clumsy joke about how rich people must get cold more often because they have more coats, and Elias let a short, humorless laugh out that was almost a sound of relief. Time passed in small increments measured by the cooling of coffee and the slow drying of Elias' collar. The conversation threaded between logistics and silence. Once Elias picked up the photograph and spoke Penelope's name in a sentence that was more concrete than a grief. "She'd take the subway to work every morning and bring home leftover bagels from the office bakery," he said. Nora listened and asked one or two small questions. Where did she work? What did she like to cook? The details came back like items retrieved from a bag. Concrete, small, human. They made Penelope visible in the room without turning her into a headline. By 8:30, the hallway was quiet for good. The building had chosen to be ordinary again. Nora felt a small hollow close, an old tension sliding under the door. Elias rose to leave, coat in hand, shoes drying by the mat. He handed Nora a folded note, not the envelope this time, a simple line he had written. The kind of thing he could not bring himself to say to a face that would later be scolded for intimacy. "If ever you need anything fixed in the building, repairs, money for the hall, anything, call me." Elias. The signature was the kind of clean script that belongs to someone used to writing checks. Nora read it, and then folded it into her palm. It was a concrete offer, not a promise of endless rescue. She considered the neatness of the signature, and then the small, practical things she needed. A new light bulb for the stairwell, a leaky pipe in the third-floor bathroom, a drawer hinge at her own oven that had been loose for months. She thought of how the building would react to a name like Elias Mercer attached to a list of errands. She thought of the cost of accepting help tied to a man's grief. She turned her face to him. "If you want to help the building, help by being quiet while people grieve," she said. "Give to the church. Pay for Mrs. Alvarez's holiday at the end of the year. Fix the light in the stairwell. Don't let what happened today become your story about how people saved you." The words were a bartering of dignity. Elias listened and then nodded slowly. "I'll do that," he said. He paused and then added, with a throat that moved in ways the mouth could not hide, "Thank you, Nora. For the coffee, for the pastry, for keeping me a human being for a few hours." The sentence carried no grand pronouncements, only an exactness Nora preferred. He put his coat on. He walked to the door and hesitated with his hand on the knob. Outside, the light had brightened to a thin morning. A broom sweep of traffic had begun. Marco stood near the entryway, suddenly a sentinel in a house that had been shaken. "Mrs.?" Alvarez peered at Elias over her glasses, and then tapped his hand in a gesture that was less a blessing than a civic nod. He stepped out and closed the door behind him with a soft, practical click. Nora reached for the cracked ceramic cup she had set on the table earlier. She had said nothing of the small ritual. She had only waited for a pause where she could make one motion that would answer the morning in a private language. She took a thin tube of gold lacquer from the drawer, an object she kept tucked away for repairs that meant more than just fixing, and she painted a hairline crack along the rim. The lacquer dried under the kitchen light, and when she ran her finger along it, the join caught the lamp's glow like a seam of amber. Marco watched her with a face that asked a question he did not voice. Mrs. Alvarez hummed under her breath and rinsed a spoon. The building shifted back into its domestic movements. Someone turned a key. Someone in the laundry room started a machine. Regular life reasserted itself with small noises. Nora set the mended cup down on the saucer and then set it on the table within reach of the seat Elias had left. It was a small, visible thing. A cup that had been repaired and placed back into use. She had protected privacy. She had set limits on what help meant. She had not accepted a headline in place of a human story. In the quiet after, a kind of repair had been done that did not rely on money or fame. The room smelled faintly of coffee and pastry, cedar and rain. Nora slid the sealed envelope into the kitchen drawer where she kept bills and spare keys, and the small jar of matches. Then she closed the drawer and the morning with it. The final sound of the chapter was concrete. A knock at the door, small and deliberate. Nora looked up. She opened the door a crack and found Marco with a clipboard and Mrs. Alvarez with a list of maintenance tasks. Marco held up his pen and said, "We ought to write down what needs fixing." For the record, his grin was a tired after joke. Mrs. Alvarez tapped the clipboard with a single finger and nodded. "Let's start with the stairwell light," she said. Nora took the clipboard and wrote the first item, stairwell light. She filled in the box beside it with a neat check. Then she closed the door on the morning's visitors and sat down with the mended cup in both hands. The small gold seam caught the kitchen light and held it. It was not a promise that would erase grief or headlines, but it was a concrete decision made in a kitchen at dawn. To protect a private sorrow, to name limits, and to begin to stitch ordinary life back together with practical acts. The kettle began to sigh on the stove as Nora set the clipboard on the table, and the chapter closed with the sound of hot water, the hum of the building, and the small, practical work that follows grief.